Okay, I think this is a this is a call it counterintuitive, but I think this is a good segue to Bitcoin as a rally cry. And the essence of this post is about how the foundation principle of Bitcoin is liberty, and liberty is not given; it is earned. And I am new to the idea of liberty. I think my exposure to Bitcoin was primarily from the lens of technology first. I was just curious about this thing which has its own consensus mechanism. This was my entry point into Bitcoin. It was through Andres Antonopoulos, and I was not looking at it from the lens of freedom. And I remember when he used to mention it a lot of the times. One of the quotes, famous quotes of him, is that Bitcoin is for the other 6 billion. That was something that was always making me curious. And over the last 2 years, I've noticed that there is no Bitcoin culture as such outside of the libertarian community in America. So there is a Twitter culture, of course. There is some culture developing on Nostr, but overall, I think Bitcoin is still a very new thing in terms of culture. So whatever we have in history before Bitcoin is the libertarian movement, which always advocated for life, liberty, and property. And property is the core of the value proposition of Bitcoin because it allows you to store and transfer value without permission um, and use your money in a sovereign way, which no other financial instrument or no other money allows you to do. So yeah, I think there is a lot of I think counterintuitive perspective to Bitcoin that it has a life of its own, but I still believe it is individuals who at the end of the day give it value, and it is all of us who are who are responsible for its health and for its understanding, and in our best way to articulate it to people who might or might not understand it. So, yeah, with that background, let's start. And as always, if anybody has any questions or any thoughts to share, feel free to um, pause me and go ahead. Um, Quote: To the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, in his open call to arms from the Alamos, Lieutenant Colonel William B. Travis began with an expression of America as an idea extending beyond borders to all Americans in the world. It was a plea to all those that valued the fight for liberty and freedom. Outnumbered 10 to 1, Travis responded to a demand for surrender with a cannon shot. He was no more than 27 years old at the time. Texas declared its independence a week later, but within days, the Alamo fell. The Travis letter became the rallying cry of a revolution. Remember the Alamo. Ultimately, Texas won its independence, always outnumbered. It is a reminder that the endless pursuit of freedom is the most powerful equalizer, and it is something inherent to the character of Americans in all the world. One point, I think currently Bitcoin is not an American thing, perhaps, I believe, because there's a lot of socialist propaganda in America as well. And I think uh, for whatever reason, it has fallen out of the liberty and freedom value system. So Bitcoin is an individual movement in my experience and in my understanding. It is for all of us individually to understand it, to value it, and to the best of our abilities verify how it works because it works independent outside of trust in any authority or any person for that matter. And yeah, so this plea was from two Americans, but I think it's safe to say that it is the plea of liberty and freedom is for all individuals and no jurisdiction or no borders of any country. Minus the lionized heroes and a literal declaration of independence, Bitcoin is still very much a fight for freedom, and it is similarly becoming a rally cry to all those that refuse to sit back and accept the fate of our tenuous financial system. The very idea of freedom may be the single most important tenet underpinning the monetary revolution to which Bitcoin is giving rise. When the war is won, it will likely find its way directly into a constitutional amendment, even though it's already covered by the First Amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear Bitcoin. Prior to Bitcoin, everyone had no practical choice but to opt into a flawed currency system. That changed when Bitcoin was released into the wild in 2009. Bitcoin is completely voluntary, it is controlled by no one, and it affords everyone the ability to store and transfer value in a form of currency that cannot be manipulated. Bitcoin may not be synonymous with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But for those that choose to rely upon it as a better path forward, it is a fundamental and inalienable right. Hmm. Just one point that I think I want to highlight is that U.S. First Amendment, the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment, guarantees freedom of life, liberty, and property. So inherently, there is a legal right as well outside of the natural right of a human to protect the property that they rightfully own. Which is in there are multiple definitions of it. I think one very interesting definition that I read and I really resonated with, I might not be able to exactly quote it, but it was how the self creates creates imposition of itself into the world, that you have control over property by enforcing your authority over that property and its use. And yeah, coming back to the legal layer, I think the American Constitution already protects the right to self custody and the right to property. So contrast this with India. India's preamble in the constitution is says that India is a socialist country, and socialism, by its definition, means that the state has control over our property. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done.
India's preamble does not say that. It was added in the amendment in 1980s.
Yes, yes. I actually haven't done the deep dive into its history, but yeah, I think only after Bitcoin, I became more aware that it was introduced through an amendment, and there is currently a case going on in the Supreme Court to remove it. I've not been following it too much. I should probably follow that. But I think where it currently stands, the preamble of India mentions that India is a socialist country. I'm not wrong. If somebody knows, please do let me know. I'll look it up
Yeah,
later.
India's preamble does mention India is a sovereign socialist republic.
Yeah,
Yeah. So just next to sovereign, the second most highly valued word is socialist.
yeah. Yep, yep. So I think it's a question that I was having a conversation with a friend, that should we even want the state to give us the right to property? Is it not a personal or natural right in a more metaphysical lens, that it's the right of an individual to rightfully own the property of the that has come out of the labor, energy, and time that he has put into it? So this is a discussion that I think is the discussion of our current generation and civilization, because clearly there is a violation of private property happening left and right in all the jurisdictions of the world. So I think this is
I think
the
just to play
core.
the devil's advocate, the argument is how was that property taken in the first place? So the argument is if the property was unfairly begotten by the one who is owning it right now, then the state should intervene and distribute the property to everyone else who did
Right,
not bear the fruits of whatever happened in the past.
right,
So I think more than philosophy, what Bitcoin does is it shapes up the possibility of people to own private property, even when state does not approve of it. So I think philosophically, like a lot of people can come to both the camps, and I think the more stronger state is, the more stronger the camp which believes in distribution will become, because it's possible to distribute simply because your money is getting printed and you can distribute it from there itself. But yeah, the more powerful like Bitcoin ecosystem becomes, it will be difficult to redistribute whatever property one has, in my opinion.
makes sense, makes sense. Yeah, I think just one point that I personally believe that a lot. I mean, there is this narrative or argument that there is coercion in property in the current system. I would argue that it is not coercion, because people are complying with it. It's India is a welfare state. It is a socialist country. So fundamentally, as a civilization, and ignorance can't be an excuse that most people aren't aware that India is a socialist country. So people are subscribing to that rule, and I know this is a very controversial subject, so we might not be able to cover it, and this might not be the right forum for it. But I think uh, a state becoming powerful is a virtue or symptom of individuals not taking the responsibility of understanding property and how it is created, and which allows for this rampant theft, which most people have become apathetic to. But yeah, I mean, these are good points, and I think more discussion is needed in that direction. But for now, I think we'll go ahead. But yeah, if somebody wants to continue this discussion at any point, more than happy to do that.
Yeah, so my take is the natural state of things is atrophy. Like the natural third law of thermodynamics is like entropy keeps on increasing, and so everything in the universe keeps on atrophying. And if someone is not actively working on it, it will atrophy eventually. So
Right.
so look at the state of even the states like United States of America. The president is unable to recontest the elections. That's the state of the mightiest states on the planet, right? Uh, so it's not fair. I would not say the states are getting more powerful. What I would definitely say is someone who's motivated for long term to seize more power. If the wave of technology is on his or their side, they will seize that opportunity. So
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think there is this decentralization and there's this wave of technology that Bitcoin brings in that enables individuals to become sovereign, and those who will seize it. Others will probably buy Bitcoin ETFs, but
Right.
there will be some people who will seize it.
Right. Yep. Yep. Well said. Yeah. Yeah, I think somebody also mentioned an interesting point recently that I heard was that you only need 10% people to understand, value, and verify Bitcoin, because that is how social consensus works. That if enough powerful people, and by powerful, this could mean few certain things, it could mean influence, it could mean authority or self sovereignty, that you're able to defend yourself through physical or political or however means, then only that consensus is critical to reach that point where enough of economic activity will start happening on Bitcoin. So yeah, I think yeah, philosophically, like you said, I think I aligned with how if individuals have the ability, they will do it. Enough individuals, at least, or some individuals, they will reap the benefits that comes from it. Yeah. Yep. I'll read. Continue with reading the next passage. While Bitcoin is valued for different reasons by different people, it consistently appeals to those that have identified the inherent level of freedom afforded by such a powerful tool, particularly in a world full of never ending economic calamities. As the fragility and instability of the global financial system becomes more apparent by the day, central bankers and politicians scramble in a race to see who can provide more stimulus to an economy that is redlining. Lest we not forget, the instability in the financial system is not just appearing, it is reappearing. The structural issues resurfacing are the same that existed during the 2008 financial crisis. Before the oil war and the global pandemic, the repo funding markets broke in September 2019. The writing was not just on the wall, it was in the repo markets. If it were not these recent events acting as the accelerant, it would have been some other random act of God which would have made evident what remained under the surface all along, a highly levered financial system primed to break at the first sign of any material stress. Just a quick check on when this article was released because it mentions the global pandemic. In my understanding, this was in March 2020. So I think just at the beginning or when the global pandemic had started to set in. Oh, sorry. Yep, and I think this point, it took me a while to even understand what this means, a highly levered financial system. And I'll try to articulate how I understand it. Is that because of the misinformation in demand and supply dynamics of the economy, which gets created because of intervention. And this happens in primarily two ways, which is through expansion of the money supply and through price controls, is by forcing some good or service to be at a certain price target, which does not make sense because free market naturally arrives at a price for something which incorporates all the costs that it takes to manufacture it. So these two interventions, which is expansion of money supply and price controls, creates an artificial supply and demand, which is not a reflection of the true um, demand in the market or true value in the market. So what it does is this creates a distortion that is not evident to most people because price is the signal. Most people act on the price and not the underlying structure or it's humanly impossible for humans to know the underlying structure and make the calculations from it. Money is supposed to solve that problem, but because fundamentally the money is broken in society, this creates this distorted system. And this is the highly levered financial system, that it comes to the point where there is so much distortion, and which happens primarily through debt, that there is so much debt in the system in terms of the entire financial system. This, which primarily means just the government debt. It's not our individual debts, but the government piling on so much debt that it outdoes the ability to ever repay it, and it creates the system. It's a slippery slip. It starts with a slippery slope of more debt, creating this artificial boom that you are able to stimulate the economy, because you're able to almost borrow from the future. You are able to use more resources than you are generating. So by piling on more debt, the government just justifies more and more theft and creates more and more control, which is the levered financial system, and it is primed to break, because at some point individuals will realize the theft or the reduction in value or debasement of their money that is happening, and that is when um, some calamity wakes up a significant amount of people, but never enough that the entire system collapses. This is the generational question that all of us, I think, are tackling. This is the Fed balance sheet unwind, and I tried my best to understand this. So, this is the total number of US dollars in the system, by which it means that the central bank is able to oversee or regulate or have under their control this many number of dollars, which is millions of US dollars. And this is the time horizon. And yeah, so this has been pretty constant. There have been minor ups and downs. But in 2018, there was a massive reduction in the total number of dollars. I'm not exactly sure how it happens, but I know that through some banking system levers, the Federal Reserve is able to pull in a lot of cash from the economy. What that means is that they are able to block a certain amount of funds, in a very layman friendly words. They block a certain amount of funds that cannot be used in economic activity by the banks, whether it means to create more loans or to create more trade in the economy. So in 2018, 33% of all cash in the banking system was taken away by the Federal Reserve, which is called, from October 2017 to September 2019, Fed balance sheet unwind. So this unwind started to happen, and this induced this, which was in September 16th, 2019, the repo market broke. And I did a quick chat GPT research on the repo market. It stands for repurchase agreement. And this is simply just a loan that banks take from the Federal Reserve. So it's a simple financial transaction where any financial instrument, but practically it is the government bonds, are used to take loans from the Federal Reserve. So this is Federal Reserve borrowing money from the banks. At any point, please, if somebody has any clarity over this, but this was my research and understanding of this, that there was so much cash taken out of the system by the Federal Reserve that the repo market broke, and this created this crisis, and just at the start of the pandemic. Yeah. Very interestingly, I think this is the conspiracy theory that the pandemic itself was also, there's something sketchy about it. But yeah, again, that's outside of the purview of this session. And yeah, I'll just quickly read this as well. Each dollar of the Fed's balance sheet unwind effectively comes out of the bank's one to one. 800 billion, or 33% of all cash in the banking system, was removed. What did the Fed expect would happen? Yeah, so this created this yeah, huge downfall in the total number of dollars in the system, which I think created enough rise in price that the market essentially froze, and there was not enough activity, and a lot of people lost their jobs as a consequence. So this was the crisis of the pandemic. This was actually before the pandemic, because in my knowledge, it was around March 2020 that the pandemic started. So there was some catastrophe in the. I know Lynn Alden says this, that the repo market crisis was a huge thing, but only in that macroeconomics or finance uh, ecosystem or world. It was I mean, Bitcoin has some parallels with it, but even I remember I mentioned that even Bitcoin ecosystem was perhaps not as aware because this is the expertise of macroeconomics and finance, which might not always be commonly known. And the pandemic was actually a few months later. So yeah, it was apparently a huge event. Even before the global shutdown, government accelerated panic. The Fed had already supplied 500 billion in emergency funding to the repo markets. Now the fuel is really being dumped on the fire, but it is not just the scale that is alarming, it is the clear demonstration of control being lost through a meandering path of incrementalism. After the stock market crashed initially, the Fed issued an emergency 50 BPS interest rate cut, which I think is 50 basis points, which is 0.05 or 0.5%. I might be missing one decimal. So after the stock market crashed initially, the Fed issued an emergency 50 basis points interest rate cut. The market crashed some more, and the Fed then announced an incremental 1.5 trillion in short-term funding, 1 to 3 months, to be supplied in the repo markets. The market crashed again, and 3 days later, a formal 700 billion quantitative easing program was announced to outright purchase 500 billion in US government treasuries and $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities. Coinciding with this move, short-term rates were cut 100 basis points all the way to zero. So the only tool we have been learning this throughout this book, throughout this article series, the only tool that the central bank has is quantitative easing, which is just a voodoo word for cutting interest rates, which is again just a voodoo terminology or concept for expanding the money supply. So how it happens is that they reduce the cost of borrowing by cutting down the interest rates. It makes it incentivizes banks to borrow more and more because there is incentive to borrow because cost of capital is being reduced artificially. It should be more expensive to borrow the same capital, but it is being artificially made cheaper. So cutting these interest rates became necessary because of all the cash that was taken out of the system. And whether it was 50 basis points interest rate cut, whether it was 700 billion quantitative easing, whether it was purchase of 500 billion in US government treasuries and 200 billion in mortgage-backed securities, all of this just comes down to this one fundamental principle that they were cutting down the cost of capital by reducing the interest rates so that more money can be stimulated into the economy, more money can be created out of thin air. And this was all the way to zero in 2020. And yeah, apparently the 2020, the time around that was the as low as it can get. Interest rate can never go negative. You can never have. I mean, I know that there are some historical instances where interest rates have been negative. I think I'm not following the news too deeply, but recently something happened in the Japanese market as well, where they cut interest rates drastically, or I'm not sure of the details, but at any point, if there's a negative interest rate, it means that you will be stupid to not borrow because you are getting paid to lend money, to borrow money, sorry. Yeah. I'll take a pause here. We are almost 20 or 25 minutes into the session. Hmm. This is this is around the time of this is the S&P 5 index price, and in March 3rd, 50 basis point rate cut was happened, not in panic mode yet. Then on March 12th, 2020, 1.5. This was just at the start of pandemic, I believe. 1.5 trillion repo funding. Then March 15th, 100 basis point rate cut, 700 billion QE, and then March 22nd, unlimited QE plus plus. This is when I think, yeah, this was the crisis moment where, yeah, this article mentions it was basically unlimited QE. If no questions or anything to share, I'll continue reading. Yep, the market crashed again, credit markets dislocated, and the Fed followed with its whatever it takes response, announcing an unlimited QE program. It, its three most aggressive moves to date all transpired within a 10-day window, and in its last unprecedented act, the Fed will begin buying corporate bonds on the secondary market as well as participate in primary issuances of corporate credit. Yeah, so Fed usually buys government bonds, which is the way the US dollar gets created into the system. But during this unprecedented acts, the Fed was also buying corporate bonds on the secondary market. So what I think the market where the government bonds get sold are called open market operations, which is like this primary market, and the secondary market is where other financial instruments get sold and purchased. This is where the Fed bought corporate bonds as well as participate in primary issuances of corporate credit. It also expanded its purchases of mortgage-backed securities to include commercial mortgage-backed securities, commercial real estate. Yeah, so it was also expanding its purchases. So Fed has a balance sheet. It's like the big daddy who can buy everything, and it allowed corporate credit and was also purchasing mortgage-backed securities, which includes commercial real estate. In addition, the Fed established a facility to issue asset-backed securities to purchase student loans, auto loans, credit card loans, etc. All of this without a price tag and just a promise to do whatever it takes. It would be funny if it weren't so serious, but the real question is if the Fed were in control, why was it so reactionary? Why did its plans change so drastically in a 10-day period if it ever understood the extent of the issue? Never mind the unintended consequences, it is merely a demonstration that the Fed is not in control. Why would it have announced the 700 billion program if it didn't expect it to work? It's a classic game of guess and check, except the consequences can never be checked, only the immediate market reactions. The problem is our economy at stake. Hmm. Right. So it was clearly not a well thought out game. So if it's like any conspiracy theory fans, then it was not a conspiracy to do all of what happened. It was a game of losing control or less competence in enabling their value system onto the world. And yeah, I think this summarizes pretty well. I'll read this again. It's a classic game of guess and check, except the consequences can never be checked. Only the immediate market reactions. The problem is our economy at stake. Yeah, this the famous. I think it's a video clip. It's taken from this video clip, which was on 60 Minutes. There's an infinite amount of cash at Federal Reserve. This is Ben Bernanke, who was the Fed chairman during the financial crisis. To lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account they have with the Fed. It's much more akin to printing money than it is borrowing. Yes, it's this exchange of promises. The bank promises that it will pay back a certain amount, and the Fed gives its gives it the asset of that money that the bank is borrowing, and that money is the new money into supply, which is the US dollars in the banking system that the bank can now use to uh, lend to other borrowers. And here's Bitcoin. Make no mistake that the 1.5 trillion supplied to the repo markets will be converted to increment the Fed's formal quantitative easing program, and the entire unquantified program should conservatively be expected to exceed 4 trillion when all is said and done. Read this again. Make no mistake, the 1.5 trillion supplied to the repo markets will be converted to increment the Fed's formal quantitative easing program. Yeah, so it's the same thing. The quantitative easing program is essentially just what is happening, whether it is through 1.5 trillions being supplied to repo markets or corporate credit or buying um, any other asset by the Fed. And the entire unquantified program should conservatively be expected to exceed 4 trillion when all is said and done. The Fed cannot put out the fire that is a liquidity crisis through short-term funding. It will have no other choice but to monetize a large share of the credit system than it did in 2008 because the problem is now larger. In addition, while not yet passed, Congress is working on an initial 2 trillion stimulus package in response to the global pandemic. With the market already suffering a liquidity crisis, the banking system does not magically have this cash on hand to finance a massive expansion of the federal government's deficit. There is a liquidity crisis unfolding after all. As a result, the Fed will be forced to finance any fiscal response through an ever expanding quantitative easing program. It is the only way for the banks to get the cash needed to finance such a fiscal stimulus. All roads lead back to Fed and endless QE. Yeah. So while the market is going through this liquidity crisis, there is more funds being allocated to fund that deficit, and it fundamentally does not make sense, right? You cannot fund a deficit if there is no production to fund the expenses of an endeavor of any initiative. Then it's in deficit, which means it's a loss-making endeavor, and the only way out of it is to take that loss and start from scratch. But the way the financial system works is by pumping more money into the system, which is essentially just stealing value from people who are storing wealth. This is the new normal, and there is nothing sustainable about it. It is also not a reality we have to accept. There is a better way. As the world looks on amidst the fear and panic, it often seems that there is no alternative. It is unclear when so many began to view the government's role as one of the fighting global pandemics rather than the free market. But that is the world for which so many seem to aggressively demand. It is a symptom of failing to understand the root problem. It is misdiagnosing the fallout of a global pandemic and falsely believing the only hope is to allocate money created out of thin air by central banks and governments. It is predictably irrational. Yeah, this is, I think, a pretty bold and profound statement. It is predictably irrational because the distortion that gets created in the pricing mechanism creates this system where the problem itself gets asked for instead of getting solved. So, in the pandemic, there was more demand for stimulus checks, and most people did not realize the consequences of what that will take place, what that will make happen. And this was predictably irrational. It was predictable because people were forced to act in a survival mindset of wanting more stimulus, even though it was irrational, even though it did not, at the first sense of any human, it will make sense to them that this was only going to cause more damage and more demand for distortion, which created this problem in the first place. There is no reason even a few month complete economic shutdown would should put the world on the brink of a global depression. Yeah, this is the exact thing that I'm trying to stress at, that there is no reason even a few month complete economic shutdown should put the world on the brink of a global depression. Instead, it is the output of an inherently fragile financial system, one dependent on perpetual credit expansion necessary to sustain itself, and without which it would begin to collapse. It is the fragility of the global financial system itself that is the problem, not a global pandemic. Do not be fooled. This isn't a pandemic induced failure of the financial system. This was a 100% eventuality, pandemic or not. If not for its heavy dependence on credit and an unsustainable degree of leverage, the world would not be waking up to the S&P 500 futures locked limit down with seeming regularity. I think this last sentence, I'll read this again, but I think what I also wanted to stress is that a lot of the time there is a lot of doom predictions of how the financial system is going to collapse, and how a lot of people imagine it is how it has been happening. That whenever there's a financial crisis, the only solution in consensus by the society seems to be more stimulus, more intervention, and more money into supply, which perpetuates the problem. So a lot of people think that things are going to be very bad and things are going to be very difficult to overcome from, but it's actually not the case. It's very metaphorically, it's just the idea that you have to fall down for you to stand up. So because the distortion is not being allowed to clear itself, to expose itself, and the oversupply of useless stuff that gets created as a result needs to go to waste for people to realize that there is overproduction, and there is demand for other things which might or might not have been produced because of intervention tactics, because of more money into supply, because of the change in human behavior that causes, because there is this survival mindset that creates when you're constantly on a hamster wheel because you're not able to store wealth. So yeah, I think it's a matter of realizing that the problem is just that the financial system is not being allowed to break, instead of the problem being that if the financial system breaks, all hell will break loose, which is not the case, because free market in a good enough time horizon. I'm not saying that there will not be serious considerations to consider to take place, and there will be multiple lives that will be affected, which are important to consider. But eventually, the free market is a better solution to figure that out over a reasonably short period of time instead of any intervention being justified. I'll read this again. If not for its heavy dependence on credit and an unsustainable degree of leverage, the world would not be waking up to the S&P 500 futures locked limit down with seeming regularity. We'll take another pause. We have about 15 minutes left. I think we should be able to cover this entire article. Just quickly check. Hi, Booth. I think Setu has dropped off. Yep, yep. Okay, if no questions, then I'll continue reading. And the economic dependence on credit as well as the high degree of system leverage are not a natural function of either capitalism or a free market. This market setup is a function of central banks everywhere. The instability is not by design, but the market structure is. In response to every economic slowdown or crisis which has appeared over the last 4 decades, central banks, including the Fed, have responded by increasing the money supply and reducing interest rates, such that existing debt levels could be sustained and such that more credit could be created. Every time the system as a whole attempted to deleverage, central banks worked to prevent it through monetary stimulus, ultimately kicking the can down the road and allowing decades of economic imbalance to accumulate in the credit system. This is the root cause of the inherent fragility in the financial system, and it is why each time an economic disruption surfaces, the monetary response from central banks need to be larger and more extreme. With greater imbalance comes the need for a bigger boat. Yep. So it's almost like a exponential curve that the system feeds on itself. That every time there is a crisis, because there is so much distortion over the last decades, over the last handful of decades, um, the the only way that the central banks knows how to come out of it is through more distortion by creating more money into supply. So every time this happens, you need to create larger pool of money than the last time. So it accelerates and feeds on itself, and this is where the hyperinflation cycle starts to kick in over a long enough time horizon, which is not that long, which is a matter of a few decades at max. In doing so, the entire system is pushed further and further out onto the same ledge. The terminal risk to the system, the stability of the underlying currency, becomes greater and greater. Everyone is unwittingly forced to be along for this most unnerving of rides, but for those paying attention to the real game that is being played, Bitcoin is increasingly becoming the clearest path to opt out of the insanity. Simplified down to the least common denominator, quantitative easing is a forced debasement or devaluation of monetary savings. It distorts every pricing mechanism within an economy, and its intended goal is the expansion of credit. When history books are written of this pre-Bitcoin era, the failure to understand the consequence of distorting global pricing mechanisms will be identified as the source of all other critically flawed assumptions in modern central banking doctrine. There is no escaping it. You can only hope to manage the fallout. But where don't tread on me meets the come and take it mentality, freedom loving Americans of all the world and of all walks of life are beginning to say enough is enough. There has to be a better way because there always is. I'll read the last line again. But where don't tread on me, which is private property, meets the come and take it mentality, which is survival, that private property is inherently always meant to be private property, that it was always rightfully yours. But when it meets that come and take it mentality, freedom loving Americans, which I think I will substitute for individuals of all the world and of all walks of life, are beginning to say enough is enough. There has to be a better way because there always is. At its core to the very idea of hope and the very nature of human ingenuity, it is an unwillingness to accept the new normal as a fate accompli. If quantitative easing can be simplified down to a debasement of monetary savings, Bitcoin can be simplified down to the freedom to convert value into a form of currency that cannot be manipulated. In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek describes the function of money most aptly. It would be much truer to say that money is one of the greatest instruments of freedom ever invented by man. As he goes on to further explain, it is money that ultimately affords people a range of choice far greater than could otherwise be imaginable. It does so by distributing knowledge through its pricing mechanisms, the single most important market signal in aggregate, which facilitates economic coordination and the allocation of resources. However, as the freedoms afforded by one monetary medium become impaired, it should be no surprise that human ingenuity would find a way to route around and spawn a new creation that performs the same function more effectively. That is Bitcoin, and there is no going back. The proverbial cat is out of the bag, and the distribution of knowledge is naturally exponential. From a very information science perspective, I think Bitcoin, because it lives in the information space and there is no friction in the information space, because information is how humans take in information, take in knowledge and act on that knowledge. So information itself does not have friction in processing of the human mind. Information carries over physical medium, which is by electromagnetic waves. So I'm not sure how, if there is resistance in electromagnetic waves, but I know that communication happens over a band which travels at the speed of light. So there is information itself can now freely travel, and because Bitcoin is monetary information, it allows for calculation of value and store and transfer of value. Then there is zero friction in that distribution of knowledge. So just a rambling that I wanted to share with you guys. We're approaching the end
I
of the
was
article.
looking into the text and I was wondering where is all this written?
No, it's not. Yeah, this is my interpretation.
Yeah, yeah. I think you mentioned that pretty lady. You should have started with that. I was zooming in, zooming out, and wondering what did I miss in the passage.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I think this is a friend mentioned this to me that it's difficult to explain Bitcoin to people because people don't fundamentally think about information itself, and it just struck a chord with me that information is just signal to the human mind that you do this. It's like on a very, if I had to explain it to a 5-year-old, information is just pointing fingers that you point in a certain direction that hey, go there, you will find good things. Hey, don't go there, you will find bad things. That is information, and then the child uh, for his own mind can decide that if he wants to go here or if he wants to go that. So yeah, just sharing these ramblings that I've been having, but this is not part of the book. This is just my outside of the book interpretation. Yeah, so in that frame of mind, what money allows is to, through the pricing mechanism, of course. So Bitcoin currently is not serving the purpose of money because, in an economics definition, money is the commonly accepted medium of exchange. Bitcoin currently is not. You cannot buy most of the stuff using Bitcoin. So, but on the Bitcoin standard, where people are using Bitcoin as money and using it to trade goods and services and knowledge, then what will eventually happen is that price will speak for the value that is being created. And unlike the current system where there is massive distortion and price is not a reflection of the value that is in demand or the value that is um, that is that is being created by individuals acting freely. The promise of I'll continue reading now from this. The promise of Bitcoin is a more stable monetary system. There are no promises of what its value will be on any given day. The only assurance it provides is that its supply is not subject to manipulation or systematic debasement by a central bank or anyone else. There is the seemingly constant question as to whether Bitcoin is a safe haven, and more recently, why Bitcoin has become correlated to the broader collapsing financial markets. The simple reality is that Bitcoin is not a safe haven, at least not as commonly defined in the mainstream. It is not held widely enough for it to possibly be a safe haven. It remains nascent, and it is perfectly predictable that at the onset of a global deleveraging event, a liquid asset would be sold along with everything else. Yeah, yeah. I think this uh, perfectly summarizes that Bitcoin currently is not safe haven or not the index of value or not the money of our civilization. So, the in the deleveraging event of the global financial system, Bitcoin will also suffer. Bitcoin, and by that I mean the purchasing power of people who are holding Bitcoin, not the network itself. So, so yeah, in that sense, it's important for I think individuals to realize that Bitcoin as a network remains anti-fragile. I think this is covered in the next statement. But Bitcoin as a monetary asset or as money itself or the value that it's the function that it provides um, is the thing that will suffer, which is not a consequence of Bitcoin, which is not a property of Bitcoin, but the property of distortion in the market. However, what remains true is that Bitcoin is the anti-fragile comparator to the inherently fragile financial system. Yep. And it's not just money as an asset or money as a commodity. It is money as a system. So Bitcoin works because individuals are incentivized for their own subjective reasons to contribute and add value to the system and reinforce its security. So yeah, Bitcoin is not just one commodity that is being traded in the market. It's a system itself, and that system is the anti-fragile comparator to the inherently fragile financial system. In his book under the same name, Nassim Taleb describes anti-fragility as not just robust or resilient, but as the opposite of fragile. Anti-fragile systems actually gain strength and feed on volatility. The recent volatility in Bitcoin is likely just the beginning, but what it really represents is uninterrupted and unceasing price discovery. There are no circuit breakers in Bitcoin and there are no bailouts. Each individual participant is maximally accountable and it is a market devoid of moral hazard. When the dust settles, what does not kill Bitcoin only makes it stronger. In a literal sense, it is surviving and thriving in the wild without any central coordination. It is not for the faint of heart, but it is the land of the free and the home of the brave. When it survives, there will still only be 21 million Bitcoin, and its very survival will reinforce its place in the world. Increasingly, with each monetary stimulus injected into the legacy financial system, Bitcoin's core value function will become more apparent and more intuitive to more people. It will not just be by chance, it will be so because of the stark contrast Bitcoin provides. Even with all its volatility, it is laying the foundation of a more stable monetary system. Yep. Yeah. I will have to make a hard stop at 9 because I have a fun meeting. So yeah, we are I think just at the perfect pace in terms of completing this article. The Bitcoin price chart. Very interestingly, Bitcoin also went through a very, I mean, apparently I don't cover it a lot, but there was a dip in the market and there was a period of volatility, which I think had a correlation with the global financial market. So there was a massive dip in the equities market as well. So it was more of a reflection of the global financial system going through a systemic shake-up and not Bitcoin's value proposition in the market being affected. Yeah. Because the supply of Bitcoin cannot be manipulated, its price and its supply of credit will similarly and forever be unmanipulatable. Both will be determined on the market. As a result, the size of the Bitcoin credit system will never sustain otherwise unsustainable imbalances. Beyond the nature of its fixed supply, this is where the contrast lies in practical application. The accumulation of sustained credit system imbalances induced by central banks is the inherent source of fragility in the global economy today. In a market built on the foundation of a currency that cannot be manipulated, as soon as imbalances arise, economic forces will naturally course correct, preventing the system wide and systemic credit risk that plagues the legacy financial system. Rather than impair the future by allowing imbalances to accumulate beneath the surface, the unmanipulable supply of Bitcoin will act as a governor to stamp out fires as soon as they appear. The fragile individual components of the system will be sacrificed, and the system as a whole will become more anti fragile by that very function. I think one dumbed down interpretation or explanation of this concept is that in an unmanipulable money system, there will still be local fires and there will still be inefficiencies because humans are inefficient. there are some humans which will not be doing justice to the economic incentive that they create in the market. So there will still be suffering, there will still be course correction by those individuals or by the market, but the system as a whole will never be compromised because it is fundamentally decentralized. It is not reliant on one pillar that can affect its security or its value proposition. For Joe Squawk, your modern day average Joe, it was Facebook's Libra that made Bitcoin more intuitive. For others, it is hyperinflation in Venezuela. And now, for many, it will increasingly become the insistent reality that financial crisis and QE are a recurring fact of life. Yeah, the more and more financial crisis and QE happens, and I think one insight that I would just reiterate is that every time it happens, it accelerates the amount of money supply that's created. So it accelerates its own downfall. So it's not just that enough people need to study or understand Bitcoin, it's a matter of almost survival that people will have to learn Bitcoin. And by that time, if 10% people are able to collectively verify and ensure that Bitcoin's value proposition remains, which is censorship resistance and fixed supply, and we could debate what the exact value proposition is because that's for each individual to decide. But by that time, Bitcoin will be anti-fragile in contrast to the legacy financial system, and its value will be made clear and intuitive to more and more people. No matter how many cycles of quantitative easing the Fed and its global counterparts have in their bag of tricks, Bitcoin is inevitably becoming a rallying cry for all those that see the train wreck coming and are unwilling to stand idly by. It is not just a collective act of civil disobedience, it is an individual recognition of the need to act in self preservation. There is a point in time for most everyone when common sense and survival instinct naturally take the reins. The avenue may be different for each individual, but at the end of the day, Bitcoin is a means to preserve some form of freedom that is otherwise being impaired or infringed. Whether the government's attempt to ban Bitcoin or it is mistakenly blamed for the failures of the legacy system, always remember the simplicity of Bitcoin represents. It is nothing more than the individual freedom to convert real world value into a form of money that cannot be manipulated. It is a most basic and fundamental freedom, but one that must be earned. So, to all individuals in the world, stay humble, stack sats, and hold the damn line, whatever it takes. Yeah, come and take it. And enemy has demanded a surrender. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot. This is the rallying cry of Lieutenant Colonel William B. Travis. I have not read the history on it. Yeah. Yeah, we're just at the 9 mark. Thank you so much, guys, for sticking around and joining in the session. Thanks, Rishabh. Thanks, Faisal.
Thank you for the session.
Thank you, MSTRR.